Introduction. Broaden the margins. I was a grind. That was the word for it back in the day, the kid who sweated the details, who made flashcards. A striver, a grade hog, a worker bee, that kid, and I can see him clearly now, almost 40 years later, bent over a textbook, squinting in the glow of a cheap desk lamp. I can see him early in the morning, too, up and studying at 5 o'clock, sophomore year, high school, his stomach on low boil because he can't quite master, what? The quadratic formula? The terms of the Louisiana Purchase? The Lend-Lease policy, the mean value theorem, Eliot's use of irony as a metaphor for some damn thing? Never mind. It's long gone, the entire curriculum. All that remains is the dread. Time's running out, there's too much to learn, and some of it is probably beyond reach. But there's something else in there, too, a lower frequency signal that takes a while to pick up, like a dripping faucet in a downstairs bathroom, doubt. The nagging sense of having strayed off the trail when the gifted students were arriving at the lodge without breaking a sweat. Like so many others, I grew up believing that learning was all self-discipline, a hard, lonely climb up the sheer rock face of knowledge to where the smart people lived. I was driven more by a fear of falling than by anything like curiosity or wonder. That fear made for an odd species of student. To my siblings, I was Mr. Perfect, the serious older brother who got mostly A's. To my classmates, I was the invisible man, too unsure of my grasp of the material to speak up. I don't blame my young self, my parents, or my teachers for this split personality. How could I? The only strategy any of us knew for deepening learning, drive yourself like a sled dog, works. To some extent, effort is the single most important factor in academic success. Yet that was the strategy I was already using. I needed something more, something different, and I felt it had to exist. The first hint that it did, for me, came in the form of other students, those 2 or 3 kids in algebra or history who had, what was it? A cool head, an ability to do their best without that hunted animal look. It was as if they'd been told it was okay not to understand everything right away, that it would come in time, that their doubt was itself a valuable instrument. But the real conversion experience for me came later, when applying for college. College was the mission all along, of course. And it failed, I failed. I sent out a dozen applications and got shut down. All those years laboring before the mast and, in the end, I had nothing to show for it but a handful of thin envelopes and one spot on a waiting list, to a college I attended for a year before dropping out. What went wrong? I had no idea. I aimed too high, I wasn't perfect enough, I choked on the SATs. No matter. I was too busy feeling rejected to think about it. No, worse than rejected. I felt like a chump. Like I'd been scammed by some bogus self-improvement cult, paid dues to a guru who split with the money. So, after dropping out, I made an attitude adjustment. I loosened my grip. I stopped sprinting. Broadened the margins, to paraphrase Thoreau. It wasn't so much a grand strategy, I was a teenager, I couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of my face. There's a simple instinct to pick my head up and look around. I begged my way into the University of Colorado, sending an application along with a pleading letter. It was a simpler time then, it's a state school. And I was accepted without much back and forth. In Boulder, I began to live more for the day. Hiked a lot, skied a little, consumed too much of everything. I slept in when I could, napped at all hours, and studied here and there, mixing in large doses of mostly legal activities for which large colleges are justifiably known. I'm not saying that I majored in gin and tonics, I never let go of my studies, just allowed them to become part of my life, rather than its central purpose. And somewhere in that tangle of good living and bad, I became a student. Not just any student, either, but one who wore the burden lightly, in math and physics, and was willing to risk failure in some very difficult courses. The change wasn't sudden or dramatic. No bells rang out, no angels sang. It happened by degrees, like these things do. For years afterward, I thought about college like I suspect many people do. I'd performed pretty well despite my scattered existence, my bad habits. I never stopped to ask whether those habits were, in fact, bad. In the early 2000s, I began to follow the science of learning and memory as a reporter, first for the Los Angeles Times and then for the New York Times. This subject, specifically, how the brain learns most efficiently, was not central to my beat. I spent most of my time on larger fields related to behavior, like psychiatry and brain biology. But I kept coming back to learning, because the story was such an improbable one. Here were legit scientists, investigating the effect of apparently trivial things on learning and memory. Background music. Study location, i.e., where you hit the books. Video game breaks. Honestly, did those things matter at test time, when it came time to perform? If so, why? Each finding had an explanation, and each explanation seemed to say something about the brain that wasn't obvious. And the deeper I looked, the more odd results I found. Distractions can aid learning. Napping does, too. Quitting before a project is done, not all bad, as an almost done project lingers in memory far longer than one that is completed. Taking a test on a subject before you know anything about it improves subsequent learning. Something about these findings nagged at me. They're not quite believable at first, but they're worth trying, because they're small, easy, doable. There's no excuse for ignoring them. In the past few years, every time I have taken on some new project, for work or fun, every time I've thought about reviving a long-neglected skill, like classical guitar or speaking Spanish, the self-questioning starts, isn't there a better way? Shouldn't I be trying? And so I have. After experimenting with many of the techniques described in the studies, I began to feel a creeping familiarity, and it didn't take long to identify its source, college. My jumbled, ad hoc approach to learning in Colorado did not precisely embody the latest principles of cognitive science. Nothing in the real world is that clean. The rhythm felt similar, though, in the way the studies and techniques seeped into my daily life, into conversation, idle thoughts, even dreams. That connection was personal, and it got me thinking about the science of learning as a whole, rather than as a list of self-help ideas. The ideas, the techniques, are each sound on their own. That much was clear. The harder part was putting them together. They must fit together somehow, and in time I saw that the only way they could was as oddball features of the underlying system itself, the living brain in action. To say it another way, the collective findings of modern learning science provide much more than a recipe for how to learn more efficiently. They describe a way of life. Once I understood that, I was able to look back on my college experience with new eyes. I'd lightened up on my studies, all right, but in doing so I'd also allowed topics to flow into my non-academic life in a way I hadn't before. And it's when the brain lives with studied material that it reveals its strengths and weaknesses, its limitations and immense possibilities. As a learning machine, the brain is not like a muscle, at least not in any straightforward sense. It is something else altogether, sensitive to mood, to timing, to circadian rhythms, as well as to location, environment. It registers far more than we're conscious of and often adds previously unnoticed details when revisiting a memory or learned fact. It works hard at night, during sleep, searching for hidden links and deeper significance in the day's events. It has a strong preference for meaning over randomness, and finds nonsense offensive. It doesn't take orders so well, either, as we all know, forgetting precious facts needed for an exam while somehow remembering entire scenes from The Godfather or the lineup of the 1986 Boston Red Sox. If the brain is a learning machine, then it's an eccentric one. And it performs best when its quirks are exploited. In the past few decades, researchers have uncovered and road-tested a host of techniques that deepen learning, techniques that remain largely unknown outside scientific circles. These approaches aren't get-smarter schemes that require computer software, gadgets, or medication, nor are they based on any grand teaching philosophy, intended to lift the performance of entire classrooms. On the contrary, they are all small alterations in how we study or practice that we can apply individually, in our own lives, right now. The hardest part in doing so may be trusting that they work. That requires some suspension of disbelief because this research defies everything we've been told about how best to learn. Consider the boilerplate advice to seek out a quiet place and make that a dedicated study area. This seems beyond obvious. It's easier to concentrate, without noise, and settling in at the same desk is a signal to the brain that says, it's time to work. Yet we work more effectively, scientists have found, when we continually alter our study routines and abandon any dedicated space in favor of varied locations. Sticking to one learning ritual, in other words, slows us down. Another common assumption is that the best way to master a particular skill, say, long division or playing a musical scale, is by devoting a block of time to repetitively practicing just that. Wrong again. Studies find that the brain picks up patterns more efficiently when presented with a mixed bag of related tasks than when it's force-fed just one, no matter the age of the student or the subject area, whether Italian phrases or chemical bonds. I can't help thinking again of my own strained, scattered existence in college, up all hours and down napping many afternoons, in blithe defiance of any kind of schedule. I'm not going to say that such freeform living always leads to mastery. But I will argue that integrating learning into the more random demands of life can improve recall in many circumstances, and that what looks like rank procrastination or distraction often is nothing of the kind. The science of learning, to take just one implication, casts a different light on the growing alarm over distraction and our addiction to digital media. The fear is that plugged-in Emily and Josh, pulled in 10 directions at once by texts, tweets, and Facebook messages, cannot concentrate well enough to consolidate studied information. Even worse, that all this scattered thinking will, over time, somehow weaken their brain's ability to learn in the future. This is a red herring. Distractions can of course interfere with some kinds of learning, in particular when absorption or continued attention is needed, when reading a story, say, or listening to a lecture, and if gossiping on social media steals from study time. Yet we now know that a brief distraction can help when we're stuck on a math problem or tied up in a creative knot and need to shake free. In short, it is not that there is a right way and wrong way to learn. It's that there are different strategies, each uniquely suited to capturing a particular type of information. A good hunter tailors the trap to the prey. I won't pretend, in these pages, that the science of learning has been worked out. It hasn't, and the field is producing a swarm of new ideas that continue to complicate the picture. Dyslexia improves pattern recognition. Bilingual kids are better learners. Math anxiety is a brain disorder. Games are the best learning tool. Music training enhances science aptitude. But much of this is background noise, a rustling of the leaves. The aim in this book is to trace the trunk of the tree, the basic theory and findings that have stood up to scrutiny, and upon which learning can be improved. The book unfolds in 4 sections, and from the bottom up, so to speak. It will begin with an introduction to what scientists know about how brain cells form and hold on to new information. Having a handle on this basic biology will provide a strong physical analogy for the so-called cognitive basis of learning. Cognitive science is a step up the ladder from biology and, most important for us, it clarifies how remembering, forgetting, and learning are related. These 2 chapters form the theoretical foundation for all that follows. The second section will detail techniques that strengthen our hold on facts, whether we're trying to remember Arabic characters, the elements of the periodic table, or the major players of the Velvet Revolution. Retention tools. The third section will focus on comprehension techniques, the kind we need to solve problems in math and science, as well as work our way through long, complex assignments, like term papers, work presentations, blueprints, and compositions. Appreciating how these approaches work, or at least how scientists think they do, will help us remember them and, more critically, decide whether they're of any practical use, today, in our daily lives. And, finally, Section 4 will explore 2 ways to co-opt the subconscious mind to amplify the techniques we've just described. I think of this as the learning without thinking part of the story, and it's a reassuring one to hear, and to tell. The treasure at the end of this rainbow is not necessarily brilliance. Brilliance is a fine aspiration, and Godspeed to those who have the genes, drive, luck, and connections to win that lottery. But shooting for a goal so vague puts a person at risk of worshipping an ideal, and missing the target. No, this book is about something that is, at once, more humble and more grand, how to integrate the exotica of new subjects into daily life, in a way that makes them seep under our skin. How to make learning more a part of living and less an isolated chore. We will mine the latest science to unearth the tools necessary to pull this off, and to do so without feeling buried or oppressed. And we will show that some of what we've been taught to think of as our worst enemies, laziness, ignorance, distraction, can also work in our favor. Part 1. Basic Theory. Chapter 1. The Story Maker. The Biology of Memory. The science of learning is, at bottom, a study of the mental muscle doing the work, the living brain, and how it manages the streaming sights, sounds, and scents of daily life. That it does so at all is miracle enough. That it does so routinely is beyond extraordinary. Think of the waves of information rushing in every waking moment, the hiss of the kettle, the flicker of movement in the hall, the twinge of back pain, the tang of smoke. Then add the demands of a typical layer of multitasking, say, preparing a meal while monitoring a preschooler, periodically returning work emails, and picking up the phone to catch up with a friend. Insane. The machine that can do all that at once is more than merely complex. It's a cauldron of activity. It's churning like a kicked beehive. Consider several numbers. The average human brain contains 100 billion neurons, the cells that make up its gray matter. Most of these cells link to thousands of other neurons, forming a universe of intertwining networks that communicate in a ceaseless, silent electrical storm with a storage capacity, in digital terms, of 1,000,000 gigabytes. That's enough to hold 3 million TV shows. This biological machine hums along even when it's addressed, staring blankly at the bird feeder or some island daydream, using about 90% of the energy it burns while doing a crossword puzzle. Parts of the brain are highly active during sleep, too. The brain is a dark, mostly featureless planet, and it helps to have a map. A simple one will do, to start. The sketch below shows several areas that are central to learning: the entorhinal cortex, which acts as a kind of filter for incoming information, the hippocampus, where memory formation begins, and the neocortex, where conscious memories are stored once they're flagged as keepers. This diagram is more than a snapshot. It hints at how the brain operates. The brain has modules, specialized components that divide the labor. The entorhinal cortex does one thing, and the hippocampus does another. The right hemisphere performs different functions from the left one. There are dedicated sensory areas, too, processing what you see, hear, and feel. Each does its own job, and together they generate a coherent whole, a continually updating record of past, present, and possible future. In a way, the brain's modules are like specialists in a movie production crew. The cinematographer is framing shots, zooming in tight, dropping back, stockpiling footage. The sound engineer is recording, fiddling with volume, filtering background noise. There are editors and writers, a graphics person, a prop stylist, a composer working to supply tone, feeling, the emotional content, as well as someone keeping the books, tracking invoices, the facts and figures. And there's a director, deciding which pieces go where, braiding all these elements together to tell a story that holds up. Not just any story, of course, but the one that best explains the material pouring through the senses. The brain interprets scenes in the instants after they happen, inserting judgments, meaning, and context on the fly. It also reconstructs them later on. What exactly did the boss mean by that comment? Scrutinizing the original footage to see how and where it fits into the larger movie. It's a story of a life, our own private documentary, and the film crew serves as an animating metaphor for what's happening behind the scenes. How a memory forms. How it's retrieved. Why it seems to fade, change, or grow more lucid over time. And how we might manipulate each step, to make the details richer, more vivid, clearer. Remember, the director of this documentary is not some film school graduate, or a Hollywood prince with an entourage. It's you. Before wading into brain biology, I want to say a word about metaphors. They are imprecise, practically by definition. They obscure as much as they reveal. And they're often self-serving, crafted to serve some pet purpose, in the way that the chemical imbalance theory of depression supports the use of antidepressant medication. Fair enough, all around. Our film crew metaphor is a loose one, to be sure, but then so is scientists' understanding of the biology of memory, to put it mildly. The best we can do is dramatize what matters most to learning, and the film crew does that just fine. To see how, let's track down a specific memory in our own brain. Let's make it an interesting one, too, not the capital of Ohio or a friend's phone number or the name of the actor who played Frodo. No, let's make it the first day of high school. Those tentative steps into the main hallway, the leering presence of the older kids, the gunmetal thump of slamming lockers. Everyone over age 14 remembers some detail from that day, and usually an entire video clip. That memory exists in the brain as a network of linked cells. Those cells activate, or fire, together, like a net of lights in a department store Christmas display. When the blue lights blink on, the image of a sleigh appears. When the reds come on, it's a snowflake. In much the same way, our neural networks produce patterns that the brain reads as images, thoughts, and feelings. The cells that link to form these networks are called neurons. A neuron is essentially a biological switch. It receives signals from one side and, when it flips or fires, sends a signal out the other, to the neurons to which it's linked. The neuron network that forms a specific memory is not a random collection. It includes many of the same cells that flared when a specific memory was first formed, when we first heard that gunmetal thump of lockers. It's as if these cells are bound in collective witness of that experience. The connections between the cells, called synapses, thicken with repeated use, facilitating faster transmission of signals. Intuitively, this makes some sense. Many remembered experiences feel like mental reenactments. But not until 2008 did scientists capture memory formation and retrieval directly, in individual human brain cells. In an experiment, doctors at the University of California, Los Angeles, threaded filament-like electrodes deep into the brains of 13 people with epilepsy who were awaiting surgery. This is routine practice. Epilepsy is not well understood. The tiny hurricanes of electrical activity that cause seizures seem to come out of the blue. These squalls often originate in the same neighborhood of the brain for any one individual, yet the location varies from person to person. Surgeons can remove these small epicenters of activity, but first they have to find them, by witnessing and recording a seizure. That's what the electrodes are for, pinpointing location. And it takes time. Patients may lie in the hospital with electrode implants for days on end before a seizure strikes. The UCLA team took advantage of this waiting period to answer a fundamental question. Each patient watched a series of 5 to 10-second video clips of well-known shows like Seinfeld and The Simpsons, celebrities like Elvis, or familiar landmarks. After a short break, the researchers asked each person to freely recall as many of the videos as possible, calling them out as they came to mind. During the initial viewing of the videos, a computer had recorded the firing of about 100 neurons. The firing pattern was different for each clip. Some neurons fired furiously and others were quiet. When a patient later recalled one of the clips, say of Homer Simpson, the brain showed exactly the same pattern as it had originally, as if replaying the experience. It's astounding to see this in a single trial. The phenomenon is strong, and we knew we were listening in the right place. The senior author of the study, Itzhak Fried, a professor of neurosurgery at UCLA and Tel Aviv University, told me. There the experiment ended, and it's not clear what happened to the memory of those brief clips over time. If a person had seen hundreds of Simpsons episodes, then this 5-second clip of Homer might not stand out for long. But it could. If some element of participating in the experiment was especially striking, for example, the sight of a man in a white coat, fiddling with wires coming out of your exposed brain as Homer belly laughed, then that memory could leap to mind easily, for life. My first day of high school was in September 1974. I can still see the face of the teacher I approached in the hallway when the bell rang for the first class. I was lost, the hallway was swarmed, my head racing with the idea that I might be late, might miss something. I can still see streams of dusty morning light in that hallway, the ugly teal walls, an older kid at his locker, stashing a pack of Winstons. I swerved beside the teacher and said, "Excuse me," in a voice that was louder than I wanted. He stopped, looked down at my schedule, a kind face, wire-rimmed glasses, wispy red hair. "You can follow me," he said, with a half smile. "You're in my class." Saved. I have not thought about that for more than 35 years, and yet there it is. Not only does it come back, but it does so in rich detail, and it keeps filling itself out the longer I inhabit the moment. Here's the sensation of my backpack slipping off my shoulder as I held out my schedule, now the hesitation in my step, not wanting to walk with a teacher. I trailed a few steps behind. This kind of time travel is what scientists call episodic, or autobiographical memory, for obvious reasons. It has some of the same sensual texture as the original experience, the same narrative structure. Not so with the capital of Ohio, or a friend's phone number. We don't remember exactly when or where we learned those things. Those are what researchers call semantic memories, embedded not in narrative scenes but in a web of associations. The capital of Ohio, Columbus, may bring to mind images from a visit there, the face of a friend who moved to Ohio, or the grade school riddle, what's round on both sides and high in the middle. This network is factual, not scenic. Yet it, too, fills in as the brain retrieves Columbus from memory. In a universe full of wonders, this has to be on the short list. Some molecular bookmark keeps those neuron networks available for life and gives us nothing less than our history, our identity. Scientists do not yet know how such a bookmark could work. It's nothing like a digital link on a computer screen. Neural networks are continually in flux, and the one that formed back in 1974 is far different from the one I have now. I've lost some detail and color, and I have undoubtedly done a little editing in retrospect, maybe a lot. It's like writing about a terrifying summer camp adventure in 8th grade, the morning after it happened, and then writing about it again, 6 years later, in college. The second essay is much different. You have changed, so has your brain, and the biology of this change is shrouded in mystery and colored by personal experience. Still, the scene itself, the plot, is fundamentally intact, and researchers do have an idea of where that memory must live and why. It's strangely reassuring, too. If that first day of high school feels like it's right there on the top of your head, it's a nice coincidence of language. Because, in a sense, that's exactly where it is. For much of the 20th century, scientists believed that memories were diffuse, distributed through the areas of the brain that support thinking, like pulp in an orange. Any two neurons look more or less the same, for one thing, and they either fire or they don't. No single brain area looked essential for memory formation. Scientists had known since the 19th century that some skills, like language, are concentrated in specific brain regions. Yet those seemed to be exceptions. In the 1940s, the neuroscientist Carl Lashley showed that rats that learned to navigate a maze were largely unfazed when given surgical injuries in a variety of brain areas. If there was some single memory center, then at least one of those incisions should have caused severe deficits. Lashley concluded that virtually any area of the thinking brain was capable of supporting memory. If one area was injured, another could pick up the slack. In the 1950s, however, this theory began to fall apart. Brain scientists began to discover, first, that developing nerve cells, baby neurons, so to speak, are coded to congregate in specific locations in the brain, as if pre-assigned a job. You're a visual cell, go to the back of the brain. You, over there, you're a motor neuron, go straight to the motor area. This discovery undermined the interchangeable parts hypothesis. The knockout punch fell when an English psychologist named Brenda Milner met a Hartford, Connecticut, man named Henry Molaison. Molaison was a tinkerer and machine repairman who had trouble keeping a job because he suffered devastating seizures, as many as 2 or 3 a day, which came with little warning and often knocked him down, out cold. Life had become impossible to manage, a daily minefield. In 1953, at the age of 27, he arrived at the office of William Beecher Scoville, a neurosurgeon at Hartford Hospital, hoping for relief. Molaison probably had a form of epilepsy, but he did not do well on anti-seizure drugs, the only standard treatment available at the time. Scoville, a well-known and highly skilled surgeon, suspected that whatever their cause, the seizures originated in the medial temporal lobes. Each of these lobes, there's one in each hemisphere, mirroring one another, like the core of a split apple, contains a structure called the hippocampus, which was implicated in many seizure disorders. Scoville decided that the best option was to surgically remove from Molaison's brain 2 finger-shaped slivers of tissue, each including the hippocampus. It was a gamble. It was also an era when many doctors, Scoville prominent among them, considered brain surgery a promising treatment for a wide variety of mental disorders, including schizophrenia and severe depression. And sure enough, post-op, Molaison had far fewer seizures. He also lost his ability to form new memories. Every time he had breakfast, every time he met a friend, every time he walked the dog in the park, it was as if he was doing so for the first time. He still had some memories from before the surgery, of his parents, his childhood home, of hikes in the woods as a kid. He had excellent short-term memory, the ability to keep a phone number or name in mind for 30 seconds or so by rehearsing it, and he could make small talk. He was as alert and sensitive as any other young man, despite his loss. Yet he could not hold a job and lived, more so than any mystic, in the moment. In 1953, Scoville described his patient's struggles to a pair of doctors in Montreal, Wilder Penfield, and Brenda Milner, a young researcher who worked with him. Milner soon began taking the night train down to Hartford every few months to spend time with Molaison and explore his memory. It was the start of the most unusual, decade-long partnership, with Milner continually introducing Molaison to novel experiments and he cooperating, nodding his head and fully understanding their purpose, for as long as his short-term memory could hold on. In those fleeting moments they were collaborators, Milner said, and that collaboration would quickly and forever alter the understanding of learning and memory. In her first experiment, conducted in Scoville's office, Milner had Molaison try to remember the numbers 5, 8, and 4. She then left the office to have coffee and returned 20 minutes later, asking what were the numbers. He'd remembered them by mentally rehearsing while she was gone. "Well, that's very good," Milner said. "And do you remember my name?" "No, I'm sorry," he said. "My trouble is my memory. I'm Dr. Milner, and I come from Montreal." "Oh, Montreal, Canada. I was in Canada once. I went to Toronto." "Oh. Do you still remember the number?" "Number?" Molaison said. "Was there a number?" He was a very gracious man, very patient, always willing to try the tasks I would give him. Milner, now a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the Montreal Neurological Institute and McGill University, told me. And yet every time I walked in the room, it was like we'd never met. In 1962, Milner presented a landmark study in which she and Molaison, now known as HM to protect his privacy, demonstrated that a part of his memory was fully intact. In a series of trials, she had him draw a 5-point star on a piece of paper while he watched his drawing hand in a mirror. This is awkward, and Milner made it more so. She had him practice tracing the star between borders, as if working his way through a star-shaped maze. Every time HM tried this, it struck him as an entirely new experience. He had no memory of doing it before. Yet with practice he became proficient. At one point after many of these trials, he said to me, "This was easier than I thought it would be," Milner said. The implications of Milner's research took some time to sink in. Molaison could not remember new names, faces, facts, or experiences. His brain could register the new information but, without a hippocampus, could not hold on to it. This structure and others nearby, which had been removed in the surgery, are clearly necessary to form such memories. He could develop new physical skills, however, like tracing the star and later, in his old age, using a walker. This ability, called motor learning, is not dependent on the hippocampus. Milner's work showed that there were at least two systems in the brain to handle memory, one conscious and the other subconscious. We can track and write down what we learned today in history class, or in geometry, but not in soccer practice or gymnastics, not in anything like the same way. Those kinds of physical skills accumulate without our having to think much about them. We may be able to name the day of the week when we first rode a bike at age 6, but we cannot point to the exact physical abilities that led up to that accomplishment. Those skills, the balance, the steering, the pedal motion, refined themselves and came together suddenly, without our having to track or study them. The theory that memory was uniformly distributed, then, was wrong. The brain had specific areas that handled different types of memory formation. Henry Molaison's story didn't end there. One of Milner's students, Suzanne Corkin, later carried on the work with him at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In the course of hundreds of studies spanning more than 40 years, she showed that he had many pre-surgery memories, of the war, of FDR, of the layout of his childhood house. Just memories, we call them, Dr. Corkin told me. He had the memories, but he couldn't place them in time exactly, he couldn't give you a narrative. Studies done in others with injuries in the same areas of the brain showed a similar before-after pattern. Without a functioning hippocampus, people cannot form new, conscious memories. Virtually all of the names, facts, faces, and experiences they do remember predate their injury. Those memories, once formed, must therefore reside elsewhere, outside the hippocampus. The only viable candidate, scientists knew, was the brain's thin outer layer, the neocortex. The neocortex is the seat of human consciousness, an intricate quilt of tissue in which each patch has a specialized purpose. Visual patches are in the back. Motor control areas are on the side, near the ears. One patch on the left side helps interpret language, another nearby handles spoken language, as well as written. This layer, the top of the brain, as it were, is the only area with the tools capable of recreating the rich sensory texture of an autobiographical memory, or the assortment of factual associations for the word Ohio or the number 12. The first day of high school network must be contained there, largely if not entirely. My first day memory is predominantly visual and auditory, so the network has plenty of neurons in the visual and audio cortex. Yours may include the smell of the cafeteria, the deadweight feel of your backpack, with plenty of cells in those cortical patches. To the extent that it's possible to locate a memory in the brain, that's where it resides, in neighborhoods along the neocortex primarily, not at any single address. That the brain can find this thing and bring it to life so fast, instantaneously, for most of us, complete with emotion, and layers of detail, defies easy explanation. No one knows how that happens. And it's this instant access that creates what to me is the brain's grandest illusion, that memories are filed away like video scenes that can be opened with a neural click, and snapped closed again. The truth is stranger, and far more useful. The risk of peering too closely inside the brain is that you can lose track of what's on the outside, i.e., the person. Not some generic human, either, but a real one. Someone who drinks milk straight from the carton, forgets friends' birthdays, and who can't find their house keys, never mind calculate the surface area of a pyramid. Let's take a moment to review. The close-up of the brain has provided a glimpse of what cells do to form a memory. They fire together during an experience. Then they stabilize as a network through the hippocampus. Finally, they consolidate along the neocortex in a shifting array that preserves the basic plot points. Nonetheless, to grasp what people do to retrieve a memory, to remember, requires stepping back for a wide shot. We've zoomed in, a la Google Maps, to see cells at street level. It's time to zoom out and have a look at the larger organism, at people whose perceptions reveal the secrets of memory retrieval. The people in question are, again, epilepsy patients. In some epilepsy cases, the flares of brain activity spread like a chemical fire, sweeping across wide stretches of the brain and causing the kind of full-body, blackout seizures that struck HM as a young man. Those seizures are so hard to live with, and often so resistant to drug treatment, that people consider brain surgery. No one has the same procedure HM underwent, of course, but there are other options. One of those is called split brain surgery. The surgeon severs the connections between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, so the storms of activity are confined to one side. This quiets the seizures, all right. But at what cost? The brain's left and right halves cannot talk to each other at all. Split brain surgery must cause serious damage, drastically altering someone's personality, or at least their perceptions. Yet it doesn't. The changes are so subtle, in fact, that the first studies of these so-called split brain patients in the 1950s found no differences in thinking or perception at all. No slip in IQ, no deficits in analytical thinking. The changes had to be there. The brain was effectively cut in half, but it would take some very clever experiments to reveal them. In the early 1960s, a trio of scientists at the California Institute of Technology finally did so, by devising a way to flash pictures to one hemisphere at a time. Bingo. When split-brain patients saw a picture of a fork with only their right hemisphere, they couldn't say what it was. They couldn't name it. Due to the severed connection, their left hemisphere, where language is centered, received no information from the right side. And the right hemisphere, which saw the fork, had no language to name it. And here was the kicker, the right hemisphere could direct the hand it controls to draw the fork. The Caltech trio didn't stop there. In a series of experiments with these patients, the group showed that the right hemisphere could also identify objects by touch, correctly selecting a mug or a pair of scissors by feel after seeing the image of one. The implications were clear. The left hemisphere was the intellectual, the wordsmith, and it could be severed from the right without any significant loss of IQ. The right side was the artist, the visual spatial expert. The two worked together, like co-pilots. This work percolated into the common language and fast, as shorthand for types of skills and types of people. He's a right brain guy, she's more left brain. It felt right, too. Our aesthetic sensibility, open and sensual, must come from a different place than cool logic. What does any of this have to do with memory? It took another quarter century to find out. And it wouldn't happen until scientists posed a more fundamental question: why don't we feel two-brained, if we have these two co-pilots? That was the question, ultimately, said Michael Gazzaniga, who co-authored the Caltech studies with Roger Sperry and Joseph Bogan in the 1960s. Why, if we have these separate systems, is it that the brain has a sense of unity? That question hung over the field, unanswered, for decades. The deeper that scientists probed, the more confounding the mystery seemed to be. The left brain-right brain differences revealed a clear, and fascinating, division of labor. Yet scientists kept finding other, more intricate, divisions. The brain has thousands, perhaps millions, of specialized modules, each performing a special skill. One calculates a change in light, for instance, another parses a voice tone, a third detects changes in facial expression. The more experiments that scientists did, the more specializing they found, and all of these mini programs run at the same time, often across both hemispheres. That is, the brain sustains a sense of unity not only in the presence of its left and right co-pilots. It does so amid a cacophony of competing voices coming from all quarters, the neural equivalent of open outcry at the Chicago Board of Trade. How? The split brain surgery would again provide an answer. In the early 1980s, Dr. Gazzaniga performed more of his signature experiments with split brain patients, this time with an added twist. In one, for example, he flashed a patient two pictures. The man's left hemisphere saw a chicken foot, and his right saw a snow scene. Dr. Gazzaniga then had the man choose related images for each picture from an array visible to both hemispheres, say, a fork, a shovel, a chicken, and a toothbrush. The man chose a chicken to go with the foot, and a shovel to go with the snow. So far, so good. Then Dr. Gazzaniga asked him why he chose those items, and got a surprise. The man had a ready answer for one choice: the chicken goes with the foot. His left hemisphere had seen the foot. It had words to describe it and a good rationale for connecting it to the chicken. Yet his left brain had not seen the picture of the snow, only the shovel. He had chosen the shovel on instinct but had no conscious explanation for doing so. Now, asked to explain the connection, he searched his left brain for the symbolic representation of the snow and found nothing. Looking down at the picture of the shovel, the man said, "And you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed." The left hemisphere was just throwing out an explanation based on what it could see, the shovel. It was just making up any old BS, Gazzaniga told me, laughing at the memory of the experiment. Making up a story. In subsequent studies he and others showed that the pattern was consistent. The left hemisphere takes whatever information it gets and tells a tale to conscious awareness. It does this continually in daily life, and we've all caught it in the act, overhearing our name being whispered, for example, and filling in the blanks with assumptions about what people are gossiping about. The brain's cacophony of voices feels coherent because some module or network is providing a running narration. It only took me 25 years to ask the right question to figure it out, Gazzaniga said, which was why. Why did you pick the shovel? All we know about this module is it resides somewhere in the left hemisphere. No one has any idea how it works, or how it strings together so much information so fast. It does have a name. Gazzaniga decided to call our left brain narrating system the interpreter. This is our director, in the film crew metaphor. The one who makes sense of each scene, seeking patterns and inserting judgments based on the material, the one who fits loose facts into a larger whole to understand a subject. Not only makes sense but makes up a story, as Gazzaniga put it, creating meaning, narrative, cause and effect. It's more than an interpreter. It's a story maker. This module is vital to forming a memory in the first place. It's busy answering the question what just happened? In the moment, and those judgments are encoded through the hippocampus. That's only part of the job, however. It also answers the questions what happened yesterday? What did I make for dinner last night? And, for global religions class, what were the 4 founding truths of Buddhism, again? Here, too, it gathers the available evidence, only this time it gets the sensory or factual cues from inside the brain, not from outside. Think. To recall the Buddha's truths, start with just one, or a fragment of one. Anguish. The Buddha talked about anguish. He said anguish was to be understood. That's right, that's truth number 1. The second truth had to do with meditation, with not acting, with letting go. Let go of anguish. That's it, or close. Another truth brings to mind a nature trail, a monk padding along in robes, the path. Walking the path. Follow the path. So it goes. Each time we run the tape back, a new detail seems to emerge, the smell of smoke in the kitchen, the phone call from a telemarketer. The feeling of calmness when reading Let Go of Anguish. No, it was let go of the sources of anguish. Not walk the path, but cultivate the path. These details seem new in part because the brain absorbs a lot more information in the moment than we're consciously aware of, and those perceptions can surface during remembering. That is to say, the brain does not store facts, ideas, and experiences like a computer does, as a file that is clicked open, always displaying the identical image. It embeds them in networks of perceptions, facts, and thoughts, slightly different combinations of which bubble up each time. And that just retrieved memory does not overwrite the previous one but intertwines and overlaps with it. Nothing is completely lost, but the memory trace is altered and for good. As scientists put it, using our memories changes our memories. After all the discussion of neurons and cell networks, after Lashley's rats and HM, after the hippocampus, split brain patients, and the story maker, this seems elementary, even mundane. It's not. Self-serving is right. Chapter 2. The Power of Forgetting. A New Theory of Learning. Memory contests are misleading spectacles, especially in the final rounds. At that point, there are only a handful of people left on stage and their faces reflect all varieties of exhaustion, terror, and concentration. The stakes are high, they've come a long way already, and any mistake can end it all. In a particularly tough-to-watch scene from the documentary Spellbound, about the Scripps National Spelling Bee, one 12-year-old trips over the word opsomath. He appears to be familiar with the word, he's digging deep, there's a moment when he seems to have it, but then he inserts a no where it doesn't belong. Clang. A bell rings, meaning, wrong answer, and the boy's eyes bulge in stunned disbelief. A gasp sweeps through the crowd, followed by clapping, consolation applause for effort. He slinks off stage, numb. Variations of this scene repeat, as other well-prepped contestants miss a word. They slump at the microphone, or blink without seeing, before being bathed in the same lukewarm applause. In contrast, those who move to the next round seem confident, locked in. The winner smiles when she hears her final word, logorrhea, and nails it. These competitions tend to leave us with two impressions. One is that the contestants, and especially the winners, must be extra human. How on earth are they doing that? Their brains must be not only bigger and faster, but also different from the standard issue version. Maybe they even have photographic memories. Not so. Yes, it's true that some people are born with genetic advantages, in memory capacity and processing speed. It's true, too, that these kinds of contests tend to draw from the higher end of the spectrum, from people who take a nerdy interest in stockpiling facts. Still, a brain is a brain is a brain, and the healthy ones all work the same way. With enough preparation and devotion, each is capable of seemingly wizard-like feats of memory. And photographic memories, as far as scientists can tell, don't exist, at least not in the way that we imagine. The other impression is more insidious, because it reinforces a common, self-defeating assumption: to forget is to fail. This appears self-evident. The world is so full of absent-mindedness, tuned-out teenagers, misplaced keys, and fear of creeping dementia that forgetting feels dysfunctional, or ominous. If learning is building up skills and knowledge, then forgetting is losing some of what was gained. It seems like the enemy of learning. It's not. The truth is nearly the opposite. Of course it can be a disaster to space out on a daughter's birthday, to forget which trail leads back to the cabin, or to draw a blank at test time. Yet there are large upsides to forgetting, too. One is that it is nature's most sophisticated spam filter. It's what allows the brain to focus, enabling sought-after facts to pop to mind. One way to dramatize this would be to parade all those spelling prodigies back on stage again for another kind of competition, a fast-paced tournament of the obvious. Quick, name the last book you read. The last movie you saw. The local drugstore. The Secretary of State. The World Series champions. And then faster still, your Gmail password, your sister's middle name, the Vice President of the United States. In this hypothetical contest, each of those highly concentrated minds would be drawing a lot of blanks. Why? Not due to mere absent-mindedness or preoccupation. No, these kids are alert and highly focused. So focused, in fact, that they're blocking out trivial information. Think about it, to hold so many obscure words in mind and keep the spellings straight, the brain must apply a filter. To say it another way, the brain must suppress, forget, competing information, so that apathetic doesn't leak into apothecary, or penumbra into penultimate, and keep any distracting trivia from bubbling to the surface, whether song lyrics, book titles, or names of movie actors. We engage in this kind of focused forgetting all the time, without giving it much thought. To lock in a new computer password, for example, we must block the old one from coming to mind. To absorb a new language, we must hold off the corresponding words in our native tongue. When thoroughly immersed in a topic or novel or computation, it's natural to blank on even common nouns. Could you pass me the what you call it, the thing you eat with? Fork. As the 19th century American psychologist William James observed, if we remembered everything, we should on most occasions be as ill off as if we remembered nothing. The study of forgetting has, in the past few decades, forced a fundamental reconsideration of how learning works. In a way, it has also altered what the words remember and forget mean. The relationship between learning and forgetting is not so simple and in certain important respects is quite the opposite of what people assume. Robert Bjork, a psychologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, told me. We assume it's all bad, a failure of the system. But more often, forgetting is a friend to learning. The losers in memory competitions, this research suggests, stumble not because they remember too little. They have studied tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of words, and often they are familiar with the word they ultimately misspell. In many cases, they stumble because they remember too much. If recollecting is just that, a recollection of perceptions, facts, and ideas scattered in intertwining neural networks in the dark storm of the brain, then forgetting acts to block the background noise, the static, so that the right signals stand out. The sharpness of the one depends on the strength of the other. Another large upside of forgetting has nothing to do with its active filtering property. Normal forgetting, that passive decay we so often bemoan, is also helpful for subsequent learning. I think of this as the muscle-building property of forgetting. Some breakdown must occur for us to strengthen learning when we revisit the material. Without a little forgetting, you get no benefit from further study. It is what allows learning to build, like an exercised muscle. This system is far from perfect. We have instantaneous and flawless recall of many isolated facts. It's true, Seoul is the capital of South Korea, 3 is the square root of 9, and J.K. Rowling is the author of the Harry Potter books. Yet no complex memory comes back exactly the same way twice, in part because the forgetting filter blocks some relevant details along with many irrelevant ones. Features that previously were blocked or forgotten often re-emerge. This drift in memory is perhaps most obvious when it comes to the sort of childhood tales we all tell and embellish. The time we borrowed the family car at age 14, the time we got lost on the metro the first time we visited the city. After rolling out those yarns enough times, it can be tough to tell what's true and what's not. The point is not that memory is nothing more than a pile of loose facts and a catalogue of tall tales. It's that retrieving any memory alters its accessibility, and often its content. There is an emerging theory that accounts for these and related ideas. It's called the new theory of disuse, to distinguish it from an older, outdated principle stating, simply, that memories evaporate entirely from the brain over time if they're not used. The new theory is far more than an updating, though. It's an overhaul, recasting forgetting as the best friend of learning, rather than its rival. A better name for it, then, might be the forget-to-learn theory. That phrase captures its literal implications and its general spirit, its reassuring voice. One implication, for instance, is that forgetting a huge chunk of what we've just learned, especially when it's a brand new topic, is not necessarily evidence of laziness, attention deficits, or a faulty character. On the contrary, it is a sign that the brain is working as it should. No one knows why we should be such poor judges of forgetting or other mental skills that are so indispensable, so automatic, that they feel deeply familiar. Yet we are. And it helps to count the ways. Let's go back to the beginning, then. Let's go back to the first learning laboratory of them all, to its sole occupant, and his most important contribution, the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve is exactly what it sounds like, a graph of memory loss over time. In particular, it charts the rate at which newly learned information fades from memory. It's a learning curve, turned upside down. This curve, first published in the late 1880s, falls well short of breathtaking. It's what anyone might draw if asked to guess how memory changes with time. Yet its creator, Hermann Ebbinghaus, wasn't one for idle guesswork. He was exacting by nature, compulsive about evidence. He had to be, given his ambitions. In the late 1870s, as a young philosophy PhD, he zigzagged through Europe, thinking big. He longed to bridge philosophy and science, to apply rigorous measurement to some aspect of human nature or psychology. The only problem was, he didn't know where to start. He was poking around in a second-hand Paris bookstall one afternoon when he pulled from the shelf a volume called Elements of Psychophysics by Gustav Fechner. A scientist with a mystical bent, Fechner saw a unifying mathematical connection between the inner, mental world and the outer, natural one. He argued that every human experience, even one as ephemeral as memory, should be reducible to measurable units that could be plugged into an equation of some sort. Fechner's reputation as a scientist, he'd done elegant experiments on the sensation of touch, lent his more grandiose ideas some weight. As he read, Ebbinghaus felt something inside him shift, a sensation he would describe, years later, to a student. He must have glimpsed his future as well, right then and there, because he later dedicated his greatest work, Memory, a contribution to experimental psychology, to Fechner. The memory equation. Did it even exist? If so, could it be written down? Memories come in so many shapes and sizes. There are the hour-long and the lifelong, there are dates and numbers, recipes and recitals, not to mention stories, emotional perceptions, the look on a child's face when he's dropped at the bus stop on the first day of school, the knowing smile shared between two friends who think no one is looking, the tapestry of hijinks and heartbreaks that make up a life. Our ability to recall specific facts also varies widely. Some people are good with names and faces, others are much better at retrieving numbers, dates, formulas. How on earth do you measure such a shape-shifting ghost, much less study it? A generation of scientists before Ebbinghaus had essentially stood down, taking a pass on the question. It was too much. The variables were overwhelming. Yet where some saw a justified caution, Ebbinghaus saw a lack of nerve. At the very worst we should prefer to see resignation arise from the failure of earnest investigations rather than from the persistent, helpless astonishment in the face of the difficulties, he wrote, in explaining his motives for pursuing the memory equation. He would take the dare if there was no one else. He reasoned from first principles. To study how the brain stores new information, he needed information that was, in fact, new. A list of nouns or names or numbers simply wouldn't do. People walk around with an enormous storehouse of associations for all of these things. Even abstract sketches have a Rorschach-like, evocative quality. Stare long enough at a cloud and it begins to look like a dog's head, which in turn activates hundreds of dog-related circuits in the brain. Our brain can impute meaning to almost anything. How Ebbinghaus arrived at his solution remains a mystery. Was it an invention in the commonly accepted sense of the term, that is to say, deliberate? Wrote the American psychologist David Shakow, much later, in a biographical essay. Or was it largely a discovery? What part did the gurgle of an infant, a transient progression to infancy, the reading of Jabberwocky, the expletives of the Paris coachman for the London cabbie, play? What Ebbinghaus created was a catalogue of nonsense sounds. These were single syllables, formed by sticking a vowel between two consonants. Ruhr, Hal, Mech, Bess, Shock, Deuce. By and large, they were meaningless. Ebbinghaus had found his generic memory units. He created about 2,300 of them, a pool of all possible syllables, or at least as many as he could think of. He put together lists of the syllables, random groupings of between 7 and 36 each. Then he began to memorize one list at a time, reading the syllables out loud, pacing himself with a metronome, keeping track of how many repetitions he needed to produce a perfect score. By the time he landed a job as an instructor, at the University of Berlin in 1880, he'd logged more than 800 hours of practice with his nonsense sounds. He continued the work in his small office, pacing the floor, a compact, bushy-bearded man in Ben Franklin spectacles, spitting out the syllables at a rate of as many as 150 a minute. He tested himself at various intervals, 20 minutes after studying. An hour. A day later, then a week. He varied the duration of his practice sessions, too, and found that more practice sessions generally resulted in higher test scores and a slower rate of forgetting. In 1885, he published his results in Memory, a contribution to experimental psychology, describing a simple way to calculate the rate of forgetting after a study session. The equation wasn't much to look at, but it was the first rigorous principle in the emerging branch of psychology, and precisely what he'd set out to find a decade earlier in that Paris bookstall. Ebbinghaus had his equation. He hadn't changed the world. He did, however, launch the science of learning. It is not too much to say that the recourse to nonsense syllables, as a means to the study of association, marks the most considerable advance in this chapter of psychology since the time of Aristotle, wrote English scientist Edward Titchener a generation later. Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve captured the minds of many theorists and would not let go. In 1914, the influential American education researcher Edward Thorndike turned Ebbinghaus's curve into a law of learning. He called it the law of disuse, which asserted that learned information, without continued use, decays from memory entirely, i.e., use it or lose it. The law felt right. It certainly seemed to square with experience, defining how most people thought of learning and to this day still do. Yet that definition hides more than it reveals. Here's an at-home exercise that is simple, painless, and full of literary nutrition. Take 5 minutes and study the verse below. Read it carefully and try to commit it to memory. It's from the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Wreck of the Hesperus. At daybreak, on the bleak sea beach, a fisherman stood aghast, to see the form of a maiden fair, lashed close to a drifting mast. The salt sea was frozen on her breast, the salt tears in her eyes, and he saw her hair, like the brown seaweed, on the billows fall and rise. Such was the wreck of the Hesperus, in the midnight and the snow. Christ save us all from a death like this, on the reef of Norman's Woe. Okay, now put the book aside and make a cup of coffee, take a walk, listen to the news. Distract yourself for about 5 minutes, the same amount of time you took to study it. Then, sit and write down as much of the poem as you can. Save the result. This is exactly the test that an English teacher and researcher named Philip Bosworth Ballard began administering to school children in the early 1900s in London's working-class East End. The children were thought to be poor learners, and Ballard was curious to find out why. Was it a deficit of initial learning? Or did something happen later that interfered with recall? To find out, he had them study various material, including ballads like Longfellow's, to see if he could pinpoint the source of their learning problems. Only the children had no obvious learning deficits that Ballard could find. On the contrary, their scores 5 minutes after studying were nothing special. Some did well and others didn't. Ballard wasn't finished, however. He wanted to know what happened to the studied verse over time. Did memory somehow falter in the days after these children studied? To find out, he gave them another test, 2 days later. The students were not expecting to be retested and yet their scores improved by an average of 10%. Ballard tested them once more, again unannounced, days later. JT improved from 15 to 21 lines in 3 days, he wrote of one student. Imagined she saw the lines in front of her. Of another, who improved from 3 to 11 lines in 7 days, he remarked, pictured the words on the blackboard. A third, who recalled 9 lines on the first test and, days later, 13, told Ballard, as I began to write it, I could picture it on the paper before me. This improvement wasn't merely odd. It was a flat contradiction of Ebbinghaus. Ballard doubted what he was seeing and ran hundreds of additional tests, with more than 10,000 subjects, over the next several years. The results were the same. Memory improved in the first few days without any further study, and only began to taper off after day 4 or so, on average. Ballard reported his findings in 1913, in a paper that seems to have caused mostly confusion. Few scientists appreciated what he'd done, and even today he is little more than a footnote in psychology, a far more obscure figure than Ebbinghaus. Still, Ballard knew what he had. We not only tend to forget what we have once remembered, he wrote, but we also tend to remember what we have once forgotten. Memory does not have just one tendency over time, toward decay. It has two. The other, reminiscence, Ballard called it, is a kind of growth, a bubbling up of facts or words that we don't recall having learned in the first place. Both tendencies occur in the days after we've tried to memorize a poem or a list of words. What could possibly be going on? One clue comes from Ebbinghaus. He had tested memory using only nonsense syllables. The brain has no place to put these letter trios. They're not related to one another or to anything else, they're not part of a structured language or pattern. The brain doesn't hold on to nonsense syllables for long, then, because they are nonsense. Ebbinghaus acknowledged as much himself, writing that his famous curve might not apply to anything more than what he had studied directly. Forgetting, remember, is not only a passive process of decay but also an active one, of filtering. It works to block distracting information, to clear away useless clutter. Nonsense syllables are clutter, Longfellow's The Wreck of the Hesperus is not. The poem may or may not become useful in our daily life, but at least it is nested in a mesh of neural networks representing words and patterns we recognize. That could account for why there would be a difference in how well we remember nonsense syllables versus a poem, a short story, or other material that makes sense. Yet it does not explain the increase in clarity after 2 days without rehearsal, the salt tears and hair like brown seaweed floating up from the neural deep. Those slow EastEnders showed Ballard that remembering and forgetting are not related to each other in the way everyone assumed. The forgetting curve was misleading and, at best, incomplete. It might even need to be replaced altogether. In the decades after Ballard published his findings, there was a modest flare of interest in spontaneous improvement. The effect should be easy to find, scientists reasoned, in all kinds of learning. Yet it wasn't. Researchers ran scores of experiments, and the results were all over the place. In one huge 1924 trial, for instance, people studied a word list, and took a test immediately afterward. They were then given a follow-up test, after varying delays, 8 minutes, 16 minutes, 3 days, a week. They did worse over time, on average, not better. In a 1937 experiment, subjects who studied nonsense syllables showed some spontaneous improvement after an initial exam, but only for about 5 minutes, after which their scores plunged. A widely cited 1940 study found that people's recall of a set of words, a set of brief sentences, and a paragraph of prose all declined over a 24-hour period. Even when researchers found improvement for one kind of material, like poetry, they'd find the opposite result for something else, like vocabulary lists. Experimental psychologists began to tinker with Ballard's approach and, as if struggling in quicksand, became progressively mired in confusion and doubt, wrote Matthew Huerdelee, of Brooklyn College, in his History of the Era, The Recovery of Unconscious Memories. The mixed findings inevitably led to questions about Ballard's methods. Were the children he tested really recalling more over time, or was their improvement due to some flaw in the experimental design? It wasn't a rhetorical question. What if, for example, the children had rehearsed the poem on their own time, between tests? In that case, Ballard had nothing. In an influential review of all published research up through 1943, one British learning theorist, C. E. Buxton, concluded that Ballard's spontaneous improvement effect was a now you see it now you don't phenomenon, in other words, a phantom. It wasn't long before many scientists followed Buxton's lead and begged off the hunt. There were far better things to do with the tools of psychology than chase phantoms, and certainly more culturally fashionable ones. Freudian therapy was on the rise, and its ideas of recovered memories easily trumped Ballard's scraps of Longfellow for sex appeal. The two men's conceptions of recovery were virtually identical, except that Freud was talking about repressed emotional trauma. Excavating those memories and working through them could relieve chronic, disabling anxiety, he claimed. It could change lives. If those were phantoms, they were far more lifelike than a heap of recited poetry. Besides, the real juice in learning science by the middle of the century was in reinforcement. It was the high summer of behaviorism. The American psychologist B.F. Skinner showed how rewards and punishments could alter behavior, and accelerate learning in many circumstances. Skinner tested various reward schedules against one another and got striking results. An automatic reward for a correct answer leads to little learning. Occasional, periodic rewards are much more effective. Skinner's work, which was enormously influential among educators, focused on improving teaching, rather than on the peculiarities of memory. Yet Ballard's findings didn't disappear completely. They continued to marinate in the minds of a small group of psychologists who couldn't shake the idea that something consequential might be slipping through the cracks. In the 1960s and 1970s, these curious few began to separate the poetry from the nonsense. The Ballard effect was, and is, real. It was not due to an experimental design flaw. The children in his studies could not have rehearsed lines that they did not remember after the first test. You can't practice what you don't remember. The reason researchers had had so much trouble isolating Ballard's reminiscence was because the strength of this effect is highly dependent on the material being used. For nonsense syllables, and for most lists of vocabulary words or random sentences, it's zero. There's no spontaneous improvement on test scores after a day or two. By contrast, reminiscence is strong for imagery, for photographs, drawings, paintings, and poetry, with its word pictures, and it takes time to happen. Ballard had identified the bubbling up of new verse in the first few days after study, when it's strongest. Other researchers had looked for it too early, minutes afterward, or too late, after a week or more. Matthew Erdely was one of those who was instrumental in clarifying reminiscence, and he began by testing a junior colleague, Jeff Kleinbard, then at Stanford University. Erdely gave Kleinbard a group of 40 pictures to study in a single sitting, on the pretext that he should have the experience of being a subject before conducting experiments of his own. In fact, he was a subject, and Erdely tested him repeatedly, without warning, over the following week. The results were so clear and reliable, Kleinbard remembered increasingly more on tests over the first 2 days, that the two of them set up larger studies. In one, they had a group of young adults try to memorize a series of 60 sketches. The participants saw the sketches one at a time, projected on a screen, 5 seconds apart, simple drawings of things like a boot, a chair, a television. The group took a test right after and tried to recall all 60, in 7 minutes, writing down a word to describe each sketch recalled. The average score was 27. 10 hours later, however, their average was 32, a day later, 34, by 4 days, it was up to 38, where it plateaued. A comparison group, who studied 60 words presented on slides, improved from 27 to 30 in the first 10 hours, and no more. Their scores slipped slightly over the next several days. Soon it was beyond dispute that memory, as Erdely put it in a recent paper, is a heterogeneous, mottled system that both improves and declines over time. Which left theorists with a larger riddle. Why does recall of pictures improve while recall of word lists does not? Scientists had speculated about the answers all along. Maybe it was a matter of having more time to search memory. Or perhaps the delay between tests relaxed the mind, eased fatigue. Yet it wasn't until the 1980s that psychologists had enough hard evidence to begin building a more complete model that accounts for the Ballard effect and other peculiarities of memory. The theory that emerged is less a grand blueprint for how the mind works than a set of principles based on research, a theory that encompasses Ebbinghaus and Ballard, as well as many other seemingly opposed ideas and characters. The scientists who have shepherded the theory along and characterized it most clearly are Robert Bjork of UCLA and his wife, Elizabeth Ligon Bjork, also at UCLA. The new theory of disuse is largely their baby. The first principle theory is this: any memory has two strengths, a storage strength and a retrieval strength. Storage strength is just that, a measure of how well learned something is. It builds up steadily with studying, and more sharply with use. The multiplication table is a good example. It's drilled into our heads in grade school, and we use it continually throughout life, in a wide variety of situations, from balancing the bank account to calculating tips to helping our fourth grader with homework. Its storage strength is enormous. According to the Bjork's theory, storage strength can increase but it never decreases. This does not mean that everything we see, hear, or say is stored forever, until we die. More than 99% of experience is fleeting, here and gone. The brain holds on to only what's relevant, useful, or interesting, or maybe so in the future. It does mean that everything we have deliberately committed to memory, the multiplication table, a childhood phone number, the combination to our first locker, is all there, and for good. This seems beyond belief at first, given the sheer volume of information we absorb and how mundane so much of it is. Remember from Chapter 1, though, that biologically speaking there's space to burn, in digital terms, storage space for 3 million TV shows. That is more than enough to record every second of a long life, cradle to grave. Volume is not an issue. As for the mundane, it's impossible to prove that it's all there, every meaningless detail. Still, every once in a while the brain sends up a whisper of dumbfounding trivia. It happens to everyone throughout life. I'll offer an example of my own. In researching this book, I spent some time in college libraries, the old school kind, with basements and sub-basements full of stacks of old books that create the vague sensation of being on an archaeological dig. It was the musty smell, I think, that on one afternoon took me back to a month-long period in 1982 when I worked at my college library. I was hunting down an old book in some deserted corner of the Columbia University Library, feeling claustrophobic and lost, when a name popped into my head. Larry C. The name of the man at the library who was my supervisor. I met him once. Lovely guy, only I had no idea I ever knew his name. Still, here I was, seeing him in my mind's eye walking away from that one meeting, and even seeing that his boat shoes were worn in the back the way some people's get, angling toward one another. One meeting. The shoes. Perfectly meaningless. Yet I must have known the name, and I must have stored that impression of him walking off. Why on earth would I have kept that information? Because it was, at one point in my life, useful. And the forget to learn theory says, if I stored it, it's in there for good. That is, no memory is ever lost in the sense that it's faded away, that it's gone. Rather, it is not currently accessible. Its retrieval strength is low, or near zero. Retrieval strength, on the other hand, is a measure of how easily a nugget of information comes to mind. It, too, increases with studying, and with use. Without reinforcement, however, retrieval strength drops off quickly, and its capacity is relatively small. At any given time, we can pull up only a limited number of items in connection with any given cue or reminder. For example, a quack cell phone ring overheard on the bus might bring to mind the name of a friend who has the same ring, as well as several people who are owed calls. It may also trigger an older vision of the family dog belly flopping into a lake to pursue a flotilla of ducks, or your first raincoat, bright yellow with a duck bill on the hood. Thousands of other quack associations, some meaningful at the time they formed, are entirely off the radar. Compared to storage, retrieval strength is fickle. It can build quickly but also weaken quickly. One way to think of storage and retrieval is to picture a huge party in which everyone you ever met is in attendance. Mom and dad, your first grade teacher, the brand new neighbors next door, the guy who taught driver's ed in sophomore year, they're all here, mingling. Retrieval is a matter of how quickly a person's name comes to mind. Storage, by contrast, is a matter of how familiar the person is. Mom and dad, there's no escaping them. The first grade teacher, her name isn't jumping to mind but that's definitely her right there over by the door. The new neighbors, by contrast, just introduced themselves, Justin and Maria, retrieval high, but they're not familiar yet. Tomorrow morning, their names will be harder to recall. As for the driver's ed guy, the name's not coming back, and he wouldn't be so easy to pick out of a lineup, either. The class was only 2 months long. The act of finding and naming each person increases both strengths, remember. The first grade teacher, once she's reintroduced, is now highly retrievable. This is due to the passive side of forgetting, the fading of retrieval strength over time. The theory says that drop facilitates deeper learning once the fact or memory is found again. Again, think of this aspect of the forget-to-learn theory in terms of building muscle. Doing pull-ups induces tissue breakdown in muscles that, after a day's rest, leads to more strength the next time you do the exercise. That's not all. The harder we have to work to retrieve a memory, the greater the subsequent spike in retrieval and storage strength. The Bjorks call this principle desirable difficulty, and its importance will become apparent in the coming pages. That driver's ed teacher, once he's spotted, is now way more familiar than he was before, and you may remember things about him you forgot you knew, not just his name and nickname but his crooked smile, his favorite phrases. The brain developed this system for a good reason, the Bjorks argue. In its nomadic hominid youth, the brain was continually refreshing its mental map to adapt to changing weather, terrain, and predators. Retrieval strength evolved to update information quickly, keeping the most relevant details handy. It lives for the day. Storage strength, on the other hand, evolved so that old tricks could be relearned, and fast, if needed. Seasons pass, but they repeat, so do weather and terrain. Storage strength plans for the future. This combination of flighty retrieval and steady storage, the tortoise and the hare, is no less important to modern-day survival. Kids who grow up in North American households, for example, learn to look people in the eye when speaking, especially a teacher or parent. Kids in Japanese homes learn the opposite, keep your gaze down, especially when speaking to an authority figure. To move successfully from one culture to the other, people must block, or forget, their native customs to quickly absorb and practice the new ones. The native ways are hardly forgotten, their storage strength is high. But blocking them to transition to a new culture drives down their retrieval strength. And being able to do this can be a matter of life or death. An Australian who moves to the United States, for instance, must learn to drive on the right side of the road instead of the left, upending almost every driving instinct he has. There's little room for error. One Melbourne daydream and he wakes up in a ditch. Here again, the memory system forgets all the old instincts to make room for the new ones. And that's not all. If 20 years later he gets homesick and moves back to Australia, he will have to switch to driving on the left again. Yet that change will come much more easily than the first one did. The old instincts are still there, and their storage strength is still high. The old dog quickly relearns old tricks. Compared to some kind of system in which out-of-date memories were to be overwritten or erased, Bjork writes, having such memories become inaccessible but remain in storage has important advantages. Because those memories are inaccessible, they don't interfere with current information and procedures. But because they remain in memory they can, at least under certain circumstances, be relearned. Thus, forgetting is critical to the learning of new skills and to the preservation and reacquisition of old ones. Now let's return to our friend Philip Ballard. The first test his students took not only measured how much of the Hesperus poem they remembered. It also increased the storage and retrieval strengths of the verse they did remember, making it more firmly anchored in memory and more easily accessible than it was before the test. Hit, unexpectedly, with the same test 2 days later, most of the lines they recalled on test number 1 came back clearly and quickly, and as a result, their brains had time to scrounge for more words, using the remembered verse as a skeleton guide, a partially completed jigsaw puzzle, a packet of cues to shake loose extra lines. This is a poem, after all, swollen with imagery and meaning, precisely the material that shows the strongest reminiscence effect of all. Voila! They do better. Yes, the Hesperus will eventually sink if the brain stops thinking about it, and its retrieval strength will inch towards zero. But a third test, and a fourth, would anchor the poem in memory more richly still, as the brain, now being called on to use the poem regularly, would continue its search for patterns within the poem, perhaps pulling up another half line or two with each exam. Will it all come back, with enough testing, even if only half was remembered the first time? Not likely. you get something back, not everything. Try it yourself, after a day or two. Write down as much of the wreck of the Hesperus as you can, without looking. Give yourself as much time as you took on the first test at the top of the chapter. Compare the results. If you're like most people, you did a little better on the second test. Using memory changes memory, and for the better. Forgetting enables and deepens learning, by filtering out distracting information and by allowing some breakdown that, after reuse, drives retrieval and storage strength higher than they were originally. Those are the basic principles that emerge from brain biology and cognitive science, and they underlie, and will help us understand, the various learning techniques yet to come. Part 2. Retention. Chapter 3. Breaking Good Habits. The effect of context on learning. Don't forget your brain vitamins. In college, that's what passed for exam taking advice, at least among those of us who frequented a hippified pill shop in downtown Boulder. There, on a shelf behind the counter, between vials of brown serum, lotus seeds, and hemp balm, were bottles of something called study aid. The label on the back listed herbs, root products, fiber, and natural extracts. The not-so-secret ingredient was, most likely, speed. One dose delivered a bump in confidence and motivation, along with a night of focused study time. That was the upside. The downside, after sequential doses, was a ragged withdrawal that dead-ended into a sudden, dreamless sleep, not ideal for operating heavy machinery, and a clear and present danger when sitting through a long exam. Close your eyes for a second and you were out, pencil clattering to the floor, liable to awake to the words, "Time's up, please hand in your work." The "don't forget your vitamins" advice meant, above all, stay conscious. When in doubt, take an extra dose to cross the finish line. Over time, though, I began to wonder if there was something more to it. When I studied on a vitamin, I worked with a kind of silly abandon, talking to myself, pacing. And when it came time to take the test, I wanted some of that manic energy back. I wanted to hear the internal conversation, to have the same physical connection with the material. I began to think, we all did, that taking study aid right before the test made that connection happen. It wasn't only keeping us upright, it made us feel mentally closer to what we'd studied, and as a result we thought we remembered more of it. Did we actually know this to be true? No, of course not. We never tested it, we wouldn't have known how if we'd wanted to. Yet we felt like we had a lucky charm, a way to put our head in the same place during test taking as during studying. Essential it was, too, especially during finals week, with 2 and sometimes 3 tests falling on the same day. That kind of pressure drives people deep into their worst habits, whether chocolate and cigarettes, brain vitamins and nail-biting, cases of Diet Cola, or much stronger stuff. When hunkered down in this psychological survival mode, it can be a profound comfort to believe that a favorite study aid also improves exam performance. And so we did. Brain chemistry, our theory went, you want the same brain chemistry. For a long time afterward, I looked back on that kind of theorizing as pure rationalization, the undergraduate mind at its self-justifying finest. We had so many crackpot theories then, about dating and getting rich and studying, that I discarded the whole list. Still, millions of students have developed some version of the brain chemistry idea, and I think its enduring attraction is rooted in something deeper than wishful thinking. The theory fits in nicely with what we've been told about good study habits from day one: be consistent. Consistency has been a hallmark of education manuals since the 1900s, and the principle is built into our every assumption about good study habits. Develop a ritual, a daily schedule, a single place and time set aside for study and nothing else. Find a private corner of the house or the library, and a quiet niche of the day, early or late. These ideas go back at least to the Puritans and their ideal of study as devotion, but they have not changed a whit. Choose an area that is quiet and free from distractions, begins a study guide from Baylor University, though it could be from any institution. It continues, develop a study ritual to use each time you study. Use earplugs or a headset to block out noise. Say no to those who want to alter your study time, etc. it is all about consistency. And so is the study aid brain chemistry theory, if you think about it. Using the same vitamin, or, mind-altering substance, to prepare and, later, to perform may not be particularly Puritan. But it's nothing if not consistent. It is also, within reason, correct. Studying while seriously impaired is wasted time, in more ways than one, as millions of students have learned the hard way. Yet, generally speaking, we perform better on tests when in the same state of mind as when we studied, and, yes, that includes mild states of intoxication from alcohol or pot, as well as arousal from stimulants. Moods, preoccupations, and perceptions matter, too, how we feel while studying, where we are, what we see and hear. The scientific investigation into these influences, the inner mental context, so to speak, as well as the outer one, has revealed subtle dimensions of learning that we rarely, if ever, notice but can exploit to optimize our time. Along the way, paradoxically, this research has also demolished the consistency doctrine. The story begins 20 feet underwater, just off the coast of Oban, Scotland. Oban, on the Sound of Mullen facing the islands known as the Southern Hebrides, is a premier diving destination. It's within easy range of the Rondo, an American steamer that sank here in 1934 and sits, jackknifed, nose down, in 150 feet of water, a magnet for explorers in scuba gear. A half-dozen other shipwrecks are also close, the Irish Thesis, lost in 1889, the Swedish Hispania, which went down in 1954, and the waters gorse with dogfish, octopus, cuttlefish, and the psychedelic sea slugs called nudibranchs. It was here, in 1975, that a pair of psychologists from nearby Stirling University recruited a group of divers to participate in an unusual learning experiment. The psychologists, D.R. Godden and A.D. Baddeley, wanted to test a hypothesis that many learning theorists favored, that people remember more of what they studied when they return to that same study environment. This is a variation on the detective novel line. Now, Mrs. Higgins, let's return to the night of the murder. Tell me exactly what you saw and heard. Like the detective, psychologists hypothesized that features of the study location, the lighting, the wallpaper, the background music, provide the brain cues to shake free more information. The difference is that Mrs. Higgins is trying to revisit a dramatic scene, an autobiographical memory, and the researchers were applying the same idea, reinstatement, they called it, to facts, to what the Estonian psychologist Endel Talving called semantic memories. The idea seems far-fetched. Who on earth remembers what was playing through the headphones when he or she learned the definition of an isosceles triangle, or an ionic bond, or the role of viola in Twelfth Night? And when Godden and Baddeley dreamed up their experiment, the evidence for reinstatement was shabby at best. In one previous experiment, for example, participants tried to memorize word lists they heard through earphones while standing with their heads inside a box containing multicolored flashing lights. In another, subjects studied nonsense syllables while strapped to a board, which tipped on an axis like a teeter-totter, as in some cruel schoolyard prank. The reinstatement seemed to facilitate better memory, but Godden and Baddeley weren't convinced. They wanted to test drive reinstatement theory in an environment that was unusual but found in nature, not created by imaginative psychologists. So they had a group of 18 scuba divers study a list of 36 words while submerged 20 feet underwater. The researchers split the divers into two groups. An hour later, one group took a test on the words on dry land, while the others strapped on their equipment and took the test back down under, using a waterproof mic to communicate with those on land doing the scoring. The results indeed depended strongly on test location. The divers who took the test underwater did better than those who took it on land, remembering about 30% more words. That's a lot, and the two psychologists concluded that recall is better if the environment of the original learning is reinstated. Maybe the bubbles streaming past the diving mask acted as a cue, accentuating the vowels in the studied words. Maybe it was the rhythmic bellows of the breath in the mouthpiece, or the weight of the tank, plus the sight of swarming nudibranchs. or the fact that those semantic memories became part of an episodic one. Perhaps all of the above. Reinstatement seemed to work, anyway, for underwater learning. The Oban experiment lent comfort and encouragement to what would become a somewhat haphazard exploration of the influence of context on memory. The study materials in these experiments were almost always word lists, or word pairs, and the tests were usually on free recall. In one investigation, for example, people who studied a list of nonsense syllables on blue-gray cards remembered 20% more of them on a later test when the test cards were also blue-gray. In another, students who got exam questions from the same instructor who taught the material did 10% better than getting them from a neutral test proctor. A psychologist named Stephen M. Smith performed some of the most interesting experiments in this area, and it's worth looking at one of his in detail to see how scientists measure and think about so-called contextual cues. In 1985, Smith, at Texas A&M University, convened a group of 54 Psych 101 students, psychologists' standard guinea pigs, and had them study a list of 40 words. He divided the students into 3 groups. One group studied in silence. Another had a jazz number, Milt Jackson's People Make the World Go Around, playing in the background. The third had Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 24 in C minor. The music was on when the subjects arrived in their assigned rooms, and they had no reason to believe it was relevant to the experiment. They spent 10 minutes memorizing, and left. The students returned to the study room 2 days later and, without warning, they were given a test to see how many words they could freely recall. This time, Smith changed the tune for many of them. He subdivided the 3 groups. Some who'd studied to jazz took the test with jazz again, others took it with the Mozart, and others in silence. Likewise for those who studied with Mozart or in silence, they tested either in the same condition, or one of the other 2. Nothing else changed. Nothing, that is, except their scores. Smith found that those who studied with Milt Jackson playing and took the test with the same music recalled 21 words on average, twice as many as those who studied with Jackson and took the test to Mozart, or in silence. Similarly, those who studied with Mozart recalled nearly twice as many words with Mozart playing than in silence or with the jazz in the background. The punchline, of those who studied and tested in the same condition, the silence group did the worst. They recalled, on average, about half the words that the jazz or classical groups did. This is bizarre, and it raised an unexpected question: could quiet somehow be inhibiting memory? The answer was no. If it had, then those who'd studied with jazz would have done worse taking the test in silence than with Mozart. They hadn't. What to make of this, then? The higher test scores square with reinstatement theory. The background music weaves itself subconsciously into the fabric of stored memory. Cue up the same music, and more of those words are likely to resurface. The lower scores in the quiet room are harder to explain. Smith argued that they may be due to an absence of cues to reinstate. The students do not encode the absence of sound any more than they might encode the absence of any type of stimulus, such as pain or food, he wrote. As a result, the study environment is impoverished, compared to one with music in the background. By themselves, experiments like Smith's and the others don't tell us how to study, of course. We can't cue up our own personal soundtrack for an exam, and we certainly can't retrofit the exam room with the same furniture, wallpaper, and ambience as where we studied. Even if we could, it's not clear which cues are important or how strong they really are. Still, this research establishes a couple of points that are valuable in developing a study strategy. The first is that our assumptions about learning are suspect, if not wrong. Having something going on in the study environment, like music, is better than nothing. The second point is that the experience of studying has more dimensions than we notice, some of which can have an impact on retention. The contextual cues scientists describe, music, light, background colors, are annoyingly ephemeral. It's true. They're subconscious, usually untraceable. Nonetheless, it is possible to recognize them at work in our own lives. Think of an instance in which you do remember exactly where and when you learned something. I'm not talking about hearing you made the high school all-star team or got chosen prom queen, either. I mean a factual, academic, semantic memory, like who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, or how Socrates died and why. For me, it's a late night in 1982, when I was studying for a test in the university's math building. The buildings were open all night back then, and you could walk in and take a classroom for yourself, spread out, use the blackboard, and no roommates bursting in with beer or other temptations. I did it all the time, and sometimes the only other person in the place was an old guy roaming the halls, disheveled but kindly, a former physics teacher. He would wander into my classroom occasionally and say something like, "Do you know why quartz is used in watches?" I would say no, and he would explain. He was legit, he knew his stuff, and one night he strolled in and asked whether I knew how to derive the Pythagorean theorem using geometric figures. I did not. The Pythagorean theorem, the most famous equation in math, states that adding the square of the two short sides of a right triangle equals the square of the longest side. It existed in my head as A plus B equals C, and I have no idea where I was when I learned that. On that night, however, I learned a simple way to derive it, a beautiful thing it is, too, and I still can see what the guy was wearing, hear his voice, and recall precisely where on the board he drew the figure. The proof is done by calculating the area of the large square and making it equal to the sum of the figures inside, 4 triangles plus the area of the little box squared. Try it. Simplify the right side of that equation and watch what you get. I remember it any time I sit alone in some classroom or conference room under dimmed fluorescent lights, like if I've arrived first for a meeting. Those cues bring back the memory of that night and the proof itself. Those are contextual cues, when they're conscious and visible. The reason I can recall them is that they're also part of a scene, an autobiographical memory. The science tells us that, at least when it comes to retention of new facts, the subconscious ones are valuable, too. Not always, when we're submerged in analytical work, they're negligible, and not necessarily all of them. Only sometimes. So what, though? When it comes to learning, we'll take any edge we can get. I recall something else about that night, too. Normally, when visited by the ghost of physics past, I was not entirely patient. I had work to do. I could do without the lecture about the properties of quartz. That night, though, I'd finished most of my studying and was in an open, expansive mood. I was happy to sit and listen and even hear about how physics students today, they don't learn any of this. That mood was part of my environment, too, wasn't it? It had to be, I remember it. I wouldn't have sat still for the lesson otherwise. If psychologists' theory about reinstating sights and sounds was correct, then they'd have to show that it applied to internal mental states as well, to jealousy, anxiety, grumpiness, confidence, the entire mixtape of emotions running through our heads. The question was, how? No one who's gone through a bad breakup while trying to be a student will doubt the impact of mood on learning. Moods color everything we do, and when they're extreme they can determine what we remember. The clearest demonstration comes from psychiatry, and the study of bipolar disorder. People with this condition are the extreme athletes of the emotional realm. Their moods cycle between weeks or months of buoyant, manic activity and periods of dark, paralyzing depression, and they know too well that those cycles determine what they remember and what they don't. There is a particular kind of pain, elation, loneliness, and terror involved in this kind of madness, wrote the psychologist K. Redfield Jamison, who has a diagnosis of bipolar. When you're high it's tremendous. The ideas and feelings are fast and frequent like shooting stars, and you follow them until you find better and brighter ones. But, somewhere, this changes. The fast ideas are far too fast, and there are far too many. Overwhelming confusion replaces clarity. Memory goes. Indeed, researchers showed in a 1974 study that people with bipolar disorder have state-dependent memory. They remember best what happened during manic phases when they're again manic. And vice versa, when depressed, they recall events and concepts they'd learned when they were down. As the study's authors put it, associations or episodic events can be regenerated more completely in a similar mood state than they can in a different mood state. Yet bipolar is an extraordinary condition, and learning scientists could hardly rely on it to measure the effects of emotion on the rest of us. For most people, moods come and go, coloring our experience rather than defining it. Their impact on memory, if significant at all, would be far weaker than for those with bipolar. And to measure this impact in a rigorous way would mean inducing the same mood in groups of people, reliably and continuously. That's a tall order, so learning scientists began to focus not on moods per se but on the influence of differing internal mental states. Altered states. This was the 1970s, after all, when hundreds of thousands of young people were experimenting with consciousness-altering drugs, primarily LSD and marijuana. These recreational users, many of them college students, weren't interested in the effect of the drugs on their grades, they were enjoying themselves. Yet there were all sorts of rumors about the possible benefits of such substances on learning. Hallucinogens were said to be mind-expanding, capable of opening up new ways of thinking about the world. Pot allowed the brain to see connections it hadn't before. Clearly, altered states intensified experience. Might they intensify memory? The rigorous research into our inner study environment would begin with drugs, the recreational kind. And its primary sponsor was the U.S. government, which, beginning in the early 1970s, funded a string of experiments that might be called the Studying Under the Influence series. By then, a scattering of research reports had already appeared, suggesting that some drugs, like barbiturates and alcohol, could produce so-called state-dependent learning in modest amounts, the study aid effect. The government-backed researchers wanted to clarify the picture. These experiments tended to follow a similar blueprint: get people high and have them study something, then give them a test hours later, either after getting high again or after ingesting a placebo. We'll take a close look at one of these studies, to show what serious scientists and serious stoners can do when they put their heads together. In 1975, a research team led by James Eric Ike of the National Institute of Mental Health set out to test the effect of pot on retention, as well as learn something about how the drug alters what the brain does with newly studied information. The researchers recruited 30 college students and recent graduates, brought them into their lab, and gave each a joint. Half of the group got a real one and half got a placebo marijuana cigarette, which looked and smelled real but delivered no THC, the active drug. The subjects took deep inhalations, maintained them for 15 seconds, and repeated this process every 60 seconds, the authors wrote. The entire cigarette was smoked, with the aid of a holder, usually in about 8 minutes. These were not novices. On average, the participants smoked pot about 5 times a week. Within 20 minutes, those who smoked the full-strength joint were moderately high, based on their own ratings and physical measures, like pulse rate. Those who smoked the placebo did not show the same physiological changes. At this point, all 30 studied. They were handed sheets of paper and given a minute and a half to try to commit to memory 48 words. The words appeared grouped by category, for example, a type of vehicle, streetcar, bus, helicopter, train, or a musical instrument, cello, organ, trumpet, banjo. The categories were part of the experimental manipulation. We all look for patterns when trying to memorize a long list of items, bunching together those that look or sound the same, or are somehow related. The scientists wanted to see whether smoking pot influenced these higher-order cues we use to retrieve information later on, so they provided the categories. When the 90 seconds were up, the papers were taken away. 4 hours later, when the effects of the drug had worn off, the participants returned to the lab and had another smoke. Some who'd been given a real joint the first time got a placebo this time around, and vice versa. Others smoked the same type both times. 20 minutes later, without further study, they took a test. Some got a free recall test, writing down as many of the words as they could remember in 6 minutes. Others took a cued recall test, in which they saw the list of categories and filled in as many of the words in that category as they could. And sure enough, on the free recall, those who'd smoked a real joint on both occasions remembered 40% more than those who got a real one to study and a placebo for the test. The reverse was also true to a lesser extent. Those who initially studied on the placebo joint did better after smoking another placebo, compared to a real joint. The participants' memories functioned best when their brain was in the same state during study as during testing, high or not high. Why? The cued recall test helped provide an answer. The scores on this test were uniformly high, no matter what the students smoked or when. This finding suggests that the brain stores roughly the same number of words when moderately high as when not. The words are in there, either way. Yet it must organize them in a different way for later retrieval. That retrieval key comes back most clearly when the brain is in the same state, stoned or sober. The key becomes superfluous, however, when the categories are printed right there on the page. There's no need for it, because an external one is handy. As the authors wrote, the accessibility of retrieval cues which have been encoded in drug-associated state, such as that produced by a moderate dose of marijuana, appears to depend, in part, on restoration of that state at the time of desired recall. The joint placebo study also gives us an idea how strong these internal, drug-induced memory cues are. Not so strong. Give someone a real hint, like a category name, and it easily trumps the internal cues. The same thing turned out to be true for alcohol and other drugs that these researchers and others eventually studied. Internal and external cues can be good reminders, but they pale next to strong hints. The personality of the learning brain that emerges from all this work on external and internal cues is of a shifty-eyed dinner companion. It is tracking the main conversation and occasionally becoming engaged in it. At the same time, it's also periodically having a quick look around, taking in the room, sketching in sights and sounds and smells, as well as noting its internal reactions, its feelings and sensations. Thesis features, the background music, a flickering candle, a pang of hunger, help our companion recall points made during the conversation later on, especially when the topic is a new one. Still, a strong hint is better. I think about this, again, in terms of the geometric proof of the Pythagorean theorem. Summoning up that late-night scene in the math building 3 decades ago, I can begin to reconstruct the proof, but as I said, it takes some futzing to get the triangles in place. However, if someone sketches out just part of the drawing, it all comes back immediately. The strong hint provided by a partial drawing trumps the weaker ones provided by reinstating my learning environment. In a world that provided strong hints when needed, this system would be ideal. Just as it would be wonderful if, whenever we had to perform on some test, we could easily recreate the precise environment in which we studied, piping in the same music that was playing, dialing up the same afternoon light, the same mental state, all of the internal and external features that were present when the brain stored the material in the first place. I'll say this for those study aids: I could control where, when, and how much, and I believe that the vitamins allowed me to heap more information into my fragile mind at the times when I most needed to. Stimulants and other substances become a psychological crutch for so many for the same reason that researchers used them in studies. They're a quick and reliable way to reproduce a particular mental state. But there's a better way. There's a way to exploit the effects of internal and external cues without having to bet on any single environment or rely on a drug to power through. Take a look at the table below and see if you detect any patterns, any system to group the numbers and letters in memory. Give up? You should. There aren't any good storage patterns, because the man who put it together invented it that way. He designed it to be as challenging as possible to remember, a random collection. In the mid-1920s, Alexander Luria, a neuropsychologist at the University of Moscow, was studying memory when he met a newspaper reporter named Solomon Chernyshevsky. Chernyshevsky had been working at a city paper and behaving in ways that made his editor suspicious. Every morning, the staff gathered to go through a long list of the coming day's activities, the events, people, and potential stories the editor wanted tracked. The reporters all took careful notes, except for Shereshevsky, who didn't even bring a notebook. The boss, convinced the reporter was slacking, confronted him on it. "I don't need to take notes," Shereshevsky replied, "I just remember." He proceeded to detail that morning's long list of assignments, without error. Not only that day's but the previous day's meeting, and the one before that. He just remembered things, he said. This performance struck the editor as so extraordinary that he recommended that he go see Luria. And so began a famous collaboration. For the next 4 decades, Luria tested and retested Shereshevsky's, as he called him in print, to protect his identity, eventually producing a panoramic exploration of one of the largest, most precise memories the world has known. S's feats of memory seemed beyond explaining. He could study an entire matrix of random numbers for 15 minutes